I'm going to what, everyone? I'm going to start over, and so we go to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6. Beginning in verse 1, Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit will not always strive with man forever, for he indeed is flesh, and his days will be what? 120 years. Jump down to verse 5. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man, that it was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only what? Evil. How often? Continually. So God looks out at this beautiful world that He had created, and what had happened basically, Adam was disloyal. Adam had failed, and then right down the line, every descendant of Adam got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, until finally God looked out and He said, everyone is thinking about evil only continually, except He had a few faithful, and God said, I'm going to start over. I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Delete. I'm going to reset the hard drive and begin again. And so He sends this thing called the flood. Called the what, everyone? Called the flood. Now we're there in Genesis chapter 7. I want you to notice the similarities. Genesis chapter 7, and I'll pick it up in verse 11. Genesis chapter 7 and verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now it begins to rain. Look at verse 12. And the rain was on the earth for how many days and nights? Now get this picture in your mind here. It's actually quite a fascinating one. It says here that when the rains came, they not only came from above, it says the fountains of the deep were opened or loosed. Now let's get the picture in our mind here. When God originally created planet Earth, He had this fluid mass. He had a what, everyone? And then He reached His hands in and He separated the waters that were above from the waters that were underneath. Does that make sense, everyone? So there's water up here and there's water down here. If that makes sense, say amen. But look at what's happening in the flood. In the flood it says the windows of heaven were open, so now the waters are coming down, and it says the fountains of the deep were open, and so now the water's coming up, and the whole earth is once again covered by what? Do you see the similarity, yes or no? So God is basically undoing creation. In creation He began by inserting His hands, so to speak, and He brought a separation. In the flood He brings those same waters right back together, from above and from beneath. If that makes sense, say amen. Now you're still there in Genesis chapter 7. Genesis chapter 7, I'm picking it up in verse 19. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were what? Covered. So the earth was covered in what? Water. So it was a giant fluid mass. Just exactly what you had in Genesis. A giant fluid mass. Except in Genesis, He separated the waters. Genesis 1 and 2, He separated the waters. And in Genesis 6 and 7, He brings the waters back together. Are we all together, everyone? Yes or no? Fascinating. Look at verse 20. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. So the whole earth was a giant fluid mass. Now remember, go back just so you can see the similarity here. Look at Genesis chapter 1. Keep your finger right there. Look at Genesis chapter 1 and notice with me verse 2. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. It says, And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the what? Deep. And what was hovering over the face of the waters? The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters in creation. Now look at Genesis chapter 8 verse 1. Genesis chapter 8 verse 1. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a what? A wind to pass over the what? The earth, and the waters subsided or disappeared. That word wind is the word breath. It's the same word that is frequently translated spirit. And so it's very fascinating here. In Genesis 1 and 2, you have this fluid mass, the Spirit of God hovering over it, and the waters are separated. In Genesis chapter 6 and 7, the waters come back together. God puts His Spirit over them, and they begin to subside. And so what God is doing here is He is restarting creation. He's restarting what, everyone? Absolutely fascinating. And so in the beginning, God's intention was that Adam would live a faithful life, that Adam would live an obedient life, that Adam would live a righteous life, and thus be a legitimate representative of God's character. If that makes sense, say amen. But Adam failed. Isn't that true? Adam failed. So God here is going to restart. He's going to reset the hard drive, and He's got a new man. And that new man's name is Noah. That's exactly right. So you're there in Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. And we'll pick it up in verse 18. Genesis chapter 9, verse 18. Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was what? Populated. Now look at verse 20. Absolutely amazing. And Noah began to be a what? A farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Noah worked the soil. Question, what did Adam do in the garden? That's exactly right. His job was to tend the garden, to take care of the garden, to have dominion over the garden. And it says too, here's Noah, and he is a tender or a keeper of the soil. Fascinating. Now look at verse 21. It says, then he drank of the wine and became what? Drunk, and he became uncovered in his tent. And so it's actually quite fascinating here. God began in the beginning there with a man in a garden who fell because of fruit. And he restarts the creation process. And here we have God has his new man, Noah, and he begins. Noah's going to be his guy. Noah's going to be his representative. But right out of the gates, he plants a vineyard. He harvests those vineyards. He becomes what? Drunk, and lets the plan down. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Adam lost this whole thing on the issue of appetite. Noah here fails on the issue of appetite. And so